Welcome back to McCarthy Performance. We're back on the 283 fuel-injected 1957 Corvette engine, and we have to do a little line bore work to it. Caps are loose, so what we're going to do is I like to lap the registers. I got that one to fit, snap fit. What I do is I put a marker on this. I hold a file very flat and I file this. As you can see, on this one we have a low spot. We probably got a little thread pulled up. You know, it's an old block from 57. And we file that. I file that till it's flat. Then I go over it with stone. That's not my best stone, but I got a better one I go over it with. I break the edges and I get it to have a snap fit and tighten the caps. We'll get into how I tightened them. You can tell me how you don't like doing it that way, and I really don't care. You know, you can weld on the side of the caps. You can knurl the side of the cap. You can do a lot of different things, but what you got to do basically is you need to establish, if you want to move the cap one way or the other, you got to kind of figure that out. If they're in the center and they're pretty good, then you're just going to, you're going to strike one side and then the other, and then get your snap fit to where you want it to be. And then, of course, you can adjust it on the side of the cap if you have to. I peen these, and I'll go over that in detail because I still have the rest to do, obviously. The rear main on these are a big deal. You really got to take your time and do it right. If you don't do it right, the thrust gets cocked. So I cut the cap according to how it lays in the block, and there's a way I check that, and I'll go over that. When I say a snap fit, this is kind of what I mean. It's not going to fall out of the block. It was wobbly around in it. It's not going to make a good register. It's not going to hold consistent bore. Excuse the finger. Let's see if I can get it to snap. That's where I like them. That's where I want it. It ain't going to go nowhere once you put the bolts in. Now these registers, they only have to hold the caps on until you tighten up the bolts. And you know, as long as they don't walk around, they're not going to probably move around. On a big horsepower engine, that could very well be a different story, and it probably is, and it is. But that's a conversation for another day. This is just a lonely old 283 horse, and once these bolts are tight, I'm going to assure that my bearings are going to be in the right location. That's all I care about. And that, of course, that it's as good as we can make it, and that's what I intend to do. Here, the caps are loose. I'm going to show you how I do it. Disclaimer, don't do it this way. This way, there's many ways to do it. If you don't like it, don't do it. But the caps are loose. I mean, there's no snap. There's no centering them. You know, when you put the bearings in, you want them to be repeatable, so it goes back together every single time the same way, especially when you line bore it, because the caps can move, you know. So you got to have that register in there. So we're going to establish the snap fit, and this is how I do it. I'm not trying to move the cap side to side. If I was trying to move the cap side to side, I would do it a little differently. And I've rolled this edge. You don't want no sharp edges. Don't use a chisel. You know, you'll put places where it can peel out, stress risers, etc., etc. So what I do is I take the hammer, I set it about 1/8 inch away from the register. I set the hammer down, I hold it straight, I do that. Then I look at it and I'll give it another one right here. Okay, then I'll take a small hammer. Iron is, to a point, fairly forgiving. You know, you don't haul off and blast it. You'll end up with a piece on the floor. And yes, you can crack it, but you also can dent it. And we're just trying to move it by peening it. And you can peen it. Okay. You always want to make sure there's a break on the edge of the cap. That eases the installation of the cap and does not bring in any material into the register area. Okay, now we got a snap fit. It's a little tighter than it needs to be, but it's favoring that it needs to go this way. So it's favoring that side. So we'll check it again. Nope, we're going to leave it. Okay, now then what I do is you can see that the cap is not laying flat on the block. So I take first we're going to break the edges of these threads on these bolts. Holes. Okay, I use a black marker for this to indicate where we're at as far as level. These are never level from the factory. Even the aftermarket ones are usually horrible. So take a file and I'll lightly go over them. You know, I only do this if I'm line boring the block. And if the housing board is good and you're not going to line bore it, then don't do this. We're not taking a lot off, but we're taking some material off. But that's okay. We don't care. We're line boring it. We want the job better than it was, and it will be. Can I throw this up in the mill and mill it? Yeah, I can do that, but why? There's been files around longer than there has been mills, and Every tool that ever existed was started out getting made by a file, so I have no problem using good file. So I got them filed flat. I'll stone them. Like I said in the previous part of the video, you always want to make sure that this area here, I put a little bit of a radius on it. I can see the corner looks pretty good, but you want to make sure that it doesn't bring in any material. So that's what I'll do, is I'll break that edge. I'll roll this a little bit, as long as you don't effectively change this, unless you want to, and you can, to move the cap. But when you move the cap one way or the other, you're going to loosen it, then you're going to chase it again, and then you might have to bring some material up on the side of the cap. You might want to consider knurling it, or a different cap. There's lots of ways to do this. This is the way I prefer to do it on this particular application. Now, tomorrow's a different day and it might change tomorrow, but today this is the way I'm doing it, because I've done them this way and I know it works. So we're calling that good. I'm going to do this one. You can see there's some pull up around the threads, like I said in the previous part of the video. They're not flat. We're just taking a fine amount of off. We're not going after it with a grinder. All this stuff requires finesse. If you have no finesse, don't do it, because you'll end up with a pile of junk. So that's what we got going here, and I'll break the edge lightly, because that's what I always do on these. Even if I'm not line boring them, I always break the edge of the material. This file's dull. Find my sharper file. There, I'm happy with that. And when it's all said and done, you can camouflage or not camouflage these. It really don't matter too much. I will trim them and clean them up a little bit. I knock the cap on 3 or 4 times to make sure it does not loosen up. If I have to go in and restrike it, I will. But if you're careful with it and you do a good job, nobody's going to probably know except you. And of course, the people that watch this video will know that I did this. Like I said, I've done this before. It works fine. A lot of times from the factory, they'll have a lot of scars in them this way all over the place. So most of the time, people don't even notice that. A little bit. So after all that, we're going to try our fitment again. This will be 2 videos, and I'll be putting in my Tobin Arp line bore machine, and that'll be a separate video, because that takes a little while to do. Well, I'm happy with that. The 3 and 9 position this way. Where the cap is, this you never can get truly 100%. You can get it pretty damn close. Depends on how much you're moving the line bore. And then at that point, then you'd want to cut down the registers, because essentially you're making a U. You can't put a hole in a hole and not change the diameter of the hole. You can cut the cap and you can get the full contact of the cap, but this area of the block, sometimes you'll have a dead area at 9 and 3. There ain't much to worry about there. All the loads here, and as long as the crush is good, and I always go to the low side of the housing bore when I bore them, you'll be fine. Well, one-man shop, I've done a fair amount of these over the years. So, you know, I kind of know what to do. If you get too close to the edge with the hammer, you'll make a mess. You want to be an 1/8 behind it at least. And then you peen it towards it. You work the iron, you work the wrinkles out of it, if that makes any sense, with a hammer. And I'm not talking about a sledgehammer, I'm talking about a little hammer that you've seen. And you can roll that metal out. Iron will dent. You can move it to a certain point, but if the caps are too loose, you're going to have to weld on them or replace the caps. That's an option, or knurl them. That's another option. There's a way that I don't knurl them necessarily, but there's a way that I do that works quite well. You know, we could get into that in another video maybe. But usually clean up. I've found in the past that if you don't take enough off the caps, the worst thing that can happen is you have to take it off the machine and reset it or cut the caps. And once you do that, you got to reset the machine all the way up, all the way back. It can be a real pain in the butt. Okay, we've got the caps. We're cutting them. I'm not cutting them for size yet. I'm just cutting them to true them up. I'll clamp them all down and then we'll check them, and then we'll adjust them. So I'll have a certain amount of material to remove from the cap and the block, and I usually take about 10 thousandths off the caps. It usually allows for a good cleanup. Okay, if you can see on the cap, you can see that it's not flat, and you want to break this edge just a little bit here. You want to round that off. So we got one cap in the cap cutter. I'm going to run it through really quick, and I'm going to take a light cut, and I'm going to show you just how far these caps are arched. So you can see they're not flat from the factory. That I'm sure was there at the factory. It's low here around the bolts, and that's kind of normal. This isn't horribly arched. Usually if they're arched a fair amount, I'll also touch up this on the mill so its bolts are pulling down on a flat surface. So we'll cut it again. Started out flat. So the caps are cut. On number 5, I use this tool here that I made. It's just a dial indicator through a chunk of steel that's been ground flat. If the cap reads, you lightly deburr this. If the cap reads different, you got to shim it. Let's say this cap here, we'll zero it out here. They're not always straight across. You would think they would be, but they're not. Okay, this one's pretty close though. Say 2 thousandths. Yeah, because it's past 0 there. So we'll say that we're going to shim this. And how I do it is I take a very light cut, very light, and I mark this on a piece of paper because I'm getting old now, and my memory ain't as good as it used to be. And I'll mark it so I know where it was originally, and I'll make a light cut and I'll try to mirror this surface, so I shim it accordingly. And then once I make my first cut, I'll measure here and here, and I'll know that there's 2 thousandths worth of indifference, and I'll put it in this cap, because that isn't a lot, but if you make that cut and you don't do it right, you cock the rear flange bearing, and the crank, when you tighten up the crank will stop. You just got to be careful of that. Now, I'm going to go over a little bit of this. Now, I flattened these out with a file, and I marked them, so I took them off as evenly as I can. Back here, that's the exception. You just go over this very lightly, and I'm going to leave it. I don't want to try to move or change anything at all. Zero. And you can see that this is the finished job. Like I said, you'll see some little marks. But all in all, the average person wouldn't know that the block was fooled with. Now, you want to try to do this. I would recommend practicing on a junk block. I've done a lot of blocks this way, a lot of them. So I got the first cap cut, and I used this gauge that I made up. And, you guys can make that up. It's easy to make. It's not too difficult to measure the cap as you progressively cut it. First cap is cut. Established the setting on my dial indicator for where I want to put it. I want to be about 10 under that. So we will do that and check it, and we'll go all along these and check them to make sure that there's at least 10 on the cap, so I can take that material or some of that out. Probably be cutting more on the cap than on the housing bore. I always try to take the least amount out of the housing bore, but you also want to make sure that it cleans up. So anyhow, this is my dial indicator. It reads intense. We'll set her in here. I got 10.5 thousandths. And then, you can check to see where the cap sets on the block. I've got probably like 7/10 with it, that it's leaning a little bit back. You can straighten that out if you want. It usually is not a problem on these caps. So I don't plan on probably chasing that out, though you most certainly could. On the rear cap, it's very important that you try to keep that under 1 thousandths. You don't want any taper in there, because it'll affect your flange bearing. And I've been doing this for a while, and I used to have a guy do my line bores before I couldn't afford a machine. And I always wanted a machine because I was putting engines together, and getting line bores were impossible to get. Anyways, I waited about a month to have one line bored, and when I got it back, I tightened it up and the crank stopped. So, you gotta really, I've been fortunate I haven't had a problem with that, but some of the best have done it, and you gotta be really careful about it. Well, that's going to be it on this video. The next one will be me setting up the Tobin Arp machine and the line borer, the TA flat top that I have, the old Tobin Arp flat top. Does a fine job, but it takes a long